This is a video about Lightroom Classic panoramas. So here I have two different versions of the same panorama that I have photographed. The first one, these three that are in the red, are shot with the shift lens. Well, both of them are shot with the shift lens, but in these three, I shifted the lens to capture the three elements. In other words, the body of the camera where the sensor is stayed stationary on the tripod, and the lens shifted from side to side, or left, right, and center. So they're actually backwards as they show up here. So the image number one here is the right side of the image. So the lens is shifted, or I've slid the lens to the right to capture more on the right side. Number two is the center of the image. You can tell by this tree here, and you can see how much I overlapped the images. They're almost a half of the image overlapped, because there's these two trees here that you can see in the center of this image there. So the right edge of the center image is the center of the right image. And the left edge of the center image is basically the center of the left side image. So those three were shot with the shifting of the lens, which means the sensor stayed in the same spot. And so everything should line up perfectly, and we should have a lot less correction for distortion in those three images. And we'll see that in a second when we merge them. The green images here, these four images, the camera has rotated on the tripod. So it starts with the right side of the image here, and we slowly rotate more to the left until we're seeing that path. And again, you can see that overlap. It's about a half. You should have at least a third of the image overlapping, but you can see that the left side of this image is the railing, and that falls almost in the center of this image. And you can kind of see that the right side of this one is that tree, and it falls almost in the center here, and then it's off to the left, and here it's all the way on the left. So you can kind of see how much overlap I did. The more overlap you have, the easier it is for the computer to match the images up and get them to line up. So we could make adjustments in our develop module before we merge these images, but these are all raw images. And so once I merge them, Lightroom will create a new DNG file, digital negative file, that is the panorama. And I can adjust that in my develop module. So I'm going to go right from my raw shots. I'm going to select these three. I held down Command on the Mac to select multiple images. I could have also selected one, held down Shift, and selected the last one, and it would select everything in between. And then I can come up to Photo, and I can come down to Photo Merge, and I can say Panorama, or I can hit Control M. When I say Panorama, then Lightroom is going to go through the process of building a preview of my image and merge those three images. So you can see in my preview here, it's got my three images together. And as I expected, with the shifting of the lens, you can see just a little bit of the white border there. There's very little excess, very little distortion or movement on the lens. It's a pretty straight shot. And that's sort of the benefit of having that shift lens, is that the sensor doesn't move, which means that everything lines up darn near perfectly. And so that's what I'm looking at here. Now, I shot horizontally on this because I wanted this to sort of be a slice out of the middle of the forest. I didn't want to see up into the sky because it was a little bit problematic at the time that I shot it, because it was bright and sunny up at the top of the trees, and it got a little bit darker down towards the bottom of the forest bed. And so I really just sort of wanted this slice out of the center. I think ultimately I may end up making this image black and white. Just that was sort of my pre-visioning of this. Let's get back to talking about the panorama. So we have three different projections. We have spherical, and again on this image, there's going to be very little difference between these three different views because the sensor didn't move. And so there isn't really any distortion to show. But spherical would be like you're standing in the middle of a globe and the image is projected around you, sort of in a 360-degree feel. Whatever section of the image that we see is being projected onto that 360-degree sphere that we're in. And so it can have a little bit of distortion or feel a little bit more like one of those 360 views that we've seen a lot of on the internet. Cylindrical is as if it's projected inside of a cylinder, no rounded top, straight sides. And that will keep your vertical lines vertical. So it'll keep all the verticals sort of straight in your image. It won't distort any of them. And then perspective, and again, it doesn't change much in this image, but we'll look at it again in the other image that we do. Perspective is sort of as if it was laid on a flat surface and we were looking at it. And so it'll try to keep all the lines straight, horizontal and vertical. I'll talk more about boundary warp, fill edges, and auto crop on the other image because it will have much more of that or show much more of what that does. The other thing that I want to kind of talk about is this create stack. And so with create stack, what it's going to do is Lightroom is going to create this panorama. And if we make it a stack, it's going to put the 3 original images all stacked up with each other in Lightroom, meaning they're all kind of tied to this panorama. So, so that you don't go in and grab them individually and use them for something else. Totally up to you whether you want to do that or not. I'm not going to do that at this point, and I am going to hit auto crop, and you can see it got rid of just those little tiny white edges. There's a little white edge up here and a little white edge down here. And when I say auto crop, it gets rid of it. And then when I say merge, you'll see the progress bar in the upper left up here as it goes through the progress of merging those photos together. And then a new file will appear down here in my timeline and up here in my grid that will show me my merged panorama. And so we'll give it just a second to come up. That new merged panorama is a new file. It is combining these 3 images together and creating a new image file that it will actually save to my disk. And it should call it one of those image numbers with Pano after it. So here it is here. Number 20 is that Pano that's been created. It's going to draw in the preview. There's my image. Everything is all there. I can go into my develop module. I can do whatever I want to do to this in the develop module. I could warm it up a little bit. I could bring the exposure down just a touch. Let's brighten up or darken the highlights. I think I'm going to darken the highlights. I'm going to brighten the shadows a little, and then I'm going to bring in some black point. We could convert it to black and white. We can work on it just like any other raw image. I can bring up the texture detail in it. It, in essence, works like a raw image. Now, we cropped it to fit. If we decide to undo that crop, I can come back and undo that crop in the develop module. Again, Lightroom is a non-destructive editor. So that's our first one. Let's take a quick peek at the second one. Let me just filter this so we can see our images. So our second one, the camera actually moved. So I'm going to select all 5 of these, and I clicked, and then I shift clicked on the last one. And then if I right click, I can come up and say photo merge and just say panorama, and it'll put these 5 images together. Now this will be a fun one because I know that my tripod ended up not being perfectly level when I shot this. And so there might be some issues with these, and there's the issue. There might be some issues with these images in that they don't perfectly line up. And so it's unable to do the perspective projection. So I'm going to choose cylindrical, and I'm going to turn off auto crop so you can see. This is what I'm saying. My image sort of dips as it goes to the right. And that's because my camera dipped as it went to the right. So my camera was aimed slightly higher on the left and slightly lower on the right, and it's created this panorama to kind of fill that in. If I hit auto crop, I am not unhappy with that crop because that really was my intention, was to really make this sort of a narrow band of the center of the forest. I didn't really want to see the floor of the forest down here. And so auto crop kind of gets rid of that for me. So this works for how I wanted this image to look. But if you don't want that to happen, then you're going to want to make sure that your tripod is level. And when I say level, I mean the legs are level below the head so that you can rotate the head of the tripod around and it'll get a perfectly level image. What this is going to do, well, let's look at Spherical real quick and see the difference. So you can see it sort of squeezed it in like it is a narrower band inside of that sphere. I think I like cylindrical better. I think I like a little bit of that stretch so that when I crop it, it still has a little bit of oomph to it. So we can boundary warp. And what boundary warp is going to do is it's going to warp or alter the shape. You can see that it has altered the shape of my images. It's rounded them to sort of get them all to fit together. But with boundary warp, what we're going to do is sort of stretch those edges out. I'll go kind of slow so you can see. It's kind of pulling the pixels and creating some new pixels, and it's going to kind of stretch my image out until it fills the full frame. Now, in my image, well, you can see here, there's a little bit of distortion in this upper left. You can see there's a little kind of a bit of a curviness to it on the right as well. And so when it's stretched those pixels or the edges of the image out, it can really kind of play with your straight lines and how your images all fit together. So you got to be careful with that. The other thing that you can do is fill edges, which will sort of sample image and try to fill in those images. And you can see that it's created sort of a weird kind of not fully normal image to kind of try to fill in those edges. So fill edges can work really well if you have just a little tiny bit. Like on our other one, I could have said fill it edges and it would have just filled in those little white spots. And then of course auto crop is going to take out. So you can do these in combination. Like we could boundary warp a little bit just to kind of get this side a little closer to this side so that when we auto crop, it kind of takes a bigger chunk out of the middle. We can kind of play around with the two of them. You can see as I keep moving it, auto crop gets a little bit wider and a little bit taller. You can also see how the distortion comes into play, right? You can kind of see how the image is getting a little bit sort of pushed around and tweaked. I'm going to do no boundary warp because again, I wanted that sort of center section, but I wanted to kind of show you how you could kind of play around with both of these. Now, the other thing we didn't talk about in the last one is there is a button here that says auto settings. And those auto settings are in reference to the develop module. And so if you click on that, it will automatically try to balance them all out. And I'll leave that on so that I can show you kind of what that does. So I'm going to say merge. And again, we're going to see the progress bar appear in the upper left, and it's going to create this panorama. And it may take it just a few minutes because it is a 5-image panorama. So the 5-image panorama has gotten me a lot more width. You can see on this top one, I didn't get a lot of width. And on the bottom one, I'm past this tree that was the right side of my top panorama. And I'm also past, let's see what the bush. Here's the bush. The bush is right before the walkway. I'm past the bush and seeing the walkway on the left side of my panorama. And so it's up to you how many shots you want to do. I could have continued to go on either side of this and just kept rotating the camera. And I could have actually even done a 360-degree panorama that would have then shown me it as one long piece, not connected on the ends. So it's a creative choice as to how many images you do. And if you wanted to see a more wider view of things, then I would have photographed this vertically instead of horizontally, because then I would have seen more on the top and the bottom. And then I would have had to take more images as I rotated to get them all to fit together so that I had all that overlap. All right, so that kicking it out into my main grid usually means that it's done. So I'm going to re-edit down, and here is my panorama that I just put together with my auto settings set. And it's loading the preview right now. So there's my preview of my image. Now I can go into the develop module and let me show you this. In the other one I showed you, but it was hard to see. If I hit crop, there's everything. I can change all the things of my crop. I can make it wider or narrower. I have full control over what I want to do. All of my settings, my auto settings are here. And so if I don't want that anymore, I can make changes to it. So I think the vibrance is a little high. There's a little too much going on in the vibrance and the saturation. I'm going to take that down. I'm going to add a little bit of texture. I think I'm going to brighten the highlights up a little bit and darken the shadows just a little bit. And maybe bring my black tone up. And then I'm going to peek at it in black and white. I like it. I think I'm going to still play with it in color a little bit. So I'm going to come back into color. I think it looks a little bit blue, and so I'm going to sort of warm it a little. And then I think it's maybe just a touch magenta, and so I'm going to bring that down. Ah, there's my greens really coming out. So that's what I kind of want to see. And then maybe at this point, I might even want to take the vibrance down just a little, just to kind of mellow the image out. So there's my panorama. It's all stitched together, and it consists of those 5 images, and it's been put together into a single image. When you're taking these photos, think about this format, right? And I did traditional horizontal panoramas. You could do a vertical panorama. These are redwood trees, and I could have done a shot from the base of the redwood tree to the top and stitched that whole thing together and had this really long, skinny, tall image. So think creatively and think it through. And take a few, try things out. They all won't work, but every one that you do will give you a little more information for the next one that you want to try. So that's panoramas in Lightroom Classic.